When most people think of E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, they probably think of an alien in drag, a young boy on a bike pedaling through the sky, or some other scene from Steven Spielberg's heartwarming 1982 sci-fi masterpiece. If you were a gamer in the 1980s, however, the word E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, specifically in that order, will conjure up images of thousands of game cartridges being unceremoniously dumped in the New Mexico desert. There have been bad games developed over the years, titles that have been rushed through production in order to meet a certain deadline, and those released in such a buggy and unfinished state that gamers have demanded their money back. But very few have been so awful that they've caused players to lose confidence in the medium and crash the market entirely. That is exactly what happened with Atari's E.T. and a handful of other games, though. And not only were gamers outraged at the quality of the game, but it contributed heavily to the crash of 1983, a mistake that Atari were keen to forget. But what happened really? How did the company, which had been famed for producing outstanding video games and consoles, fluff E.T. so badly? I, for one, would really like to know. So grab some popcorn, get yourself comfortable, and strap in for a wild ride, because I'm Ben from TripleJump, and this is the true story of E.T.'s desert burial. I probably don't need to tell you that E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, the movie, was a massive critical and commercial success. By the end of its theatrical run, it had surpassed Star Wars as the highest-grossing film of all time, raking in a whopping $619 million worldwide and garnering universal critical acclaim. Roger Ebert gave it 4 out of 4 stars. It holds a 99% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and after it was screened at the United Nations, Steven Spielberg was awarded a UN Peace Medal. All of this is to say that E.T. was rather good. Well, as we know, when films are good, or even when they're not, for that matter, tie-in video games are sure to follow, and E.T. was no different. After seeing the film rake in the cash, Warner Communications CEO Steve Ross began negotiations with Spielberg and Universal for the rights to make a video game, allegedly paying somewhere between $20 and $25 million, which was, at the time, quite a chunk of change. And, is still now, but then especially. Supposedly, when asked by Ross what he thought of doing an E.T. tie-in, Atari CEO Ray Kassar said, "I think it's a dumb idea." Well, Ray, you weren't wrong. With the rights acquired, Kassar got game designer Howard Scott Warshaw on board at the request of Spielberg, telling him that the game's development had to be complete by September 1st of 1982 in order to ensure that the title would be in little Timmy and Jenny's stockings come Christmas time. For clarity, Warshaw wasn't brought into the project until late July of 1982, giving the designer just 6 weeks to complete the game. Warshaw had previous experience working on the likes of the Raiders of the Lost Ark video game adaptation, however this had taken well over a year. Still, he was up for the challenge, and work on the game began. Warshaw spent several days coming up with the concept for E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial before pitching it to Spielberg, who, well, he wasn't exactly over the moon about it. The legendary director even voiced his disdain for the idea, asking Warshaw if he couldn't do something more like Pac-Man instead. Unperturbed by Spielberg's criticism, Warshaw ploughed on as he'd initially intended, and after a development window of just 6 weeks with no audience testing, the game made it into store shelves in time for the holiday season. And if you stop watching the video now, then all was well and nothing went badly for anyone. Released in December 1982 for the Atari 2600, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial is a top-down adventure game in which the goal is to find pieces of an interplanetary phone so that E.T. can, you've guessed it, phone home. In order to find the pieces, players must guide E.T. through different environments and have him venture into pits in which he may find phone pieces or other useful items, such as Reese's Pieces, which restore his energy. The difficulty level chosen by the player dictates how many human antagonists will come after E.T. and how quickly he can move, with adversaries taking the the form of a scientist who wants to take E.T. for observation, see dissection, and an FBI agent who wishes to steal his phone pieces and candy, see waterboarding and dissection. Once all the phone pieces are collected, E.T. must head to a specified area to make his phone call and then make it to the landing zone before the clock counts down. Once aboard his ship, the game starts over with the phone pieces moved to different pits. According to the game's manual, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial only ends when E.T. runs out of energy or you decide to quit playing. As such, it has one of the shortest run times in the history of gaming. Whilst the premise is less Bioshock and more shockingly bad, I feel it's not fair of me to judge E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial without giving it a go for myself. So I dusted off this old Atari 2600 emulator, closed all of my blinds so my neighbours wouldn't know what I was doing, poured myself a very, very large glass of alcohol, and played the darned thing. And, well, I have some thoughts. Oh, guys, it's so bad. Our adventure begins with an ear-splitting rendition of E.T.'s main theme. God, John Williams would be proud. I honestly thought my capture setup wasn't working at first, so consistently deafening are those levels. We're in, and there he is, Eric Terrestrial. Wandering around the confusing overworld, there are numerous pits that I tumbled into. Some had part of the aforementioned telephone so that I could phone home, but the vast majority of them did not. The resulting gameplay requirement is for E.T. to hurl himself into pit after pit in the desperate hope of finding a discarded piece of telecommunications device. Getting out of pits is no picnic either. Pressing the button, there's only one button, and then holding up, E.T. appears to extend his neck and float upwards, I think. Regardless, God help you if you're still holding up on the next screen, however, as I was frequently sent tumbling back down into the pit from whence I came. What's the deal with the number at the bottom of the screen, I hear you ask? Well, it doesn't seem to drain in relation to the amount of steps I'm taking, that's for sure, and goes down much, much faster when levitating out of caverns. Upon reaching 0, E.T. dies, but unfortunately the adventure is not over as a child rushes from off-screen to, and I'm making a logical assumption here, be consumed by the alien for nourishment. Those prowling agents and scientists are relatively easy to avoid, and if they capture you, sometimes you can break free. Get dragged back to their respective prison, however, and any accumulated phone parts will be confiscated before you can just sort of walk out again. It's not a very good prison. Now, I was led to believe I couldn't actually lose this game, but after running out of energy a few times, E.T. had fallen and he couldn't get up, and he was first shown outside of a house before I was booted back to chiptune hell. I managed to find 3 pieces of the phone in my best run. Would I play E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial again? Absolutely not. It's infuriating to control, confusing to play, and an assault on practically every sense I possess. What it does make me want to do, however, is crash the video game market all over again. It's safe to say that I'm not the only one that was less than impressed with E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. Both critics and players absolutely hated it. Reviewers, both at the time and more recently, criticised the title for departing from the serious tone of the film and lambasted its primitive graphics, dull, repetitive gameplay, and inane story. 1 or 2 critics did praise the game, though with the heavy caveat that it was definitely meant for children, but on the whole, E.T. was panned, and it now frequently tops lists of the worst video games ever made. Initially, the game sold well, shifting over 2.6 million copies by the end of 1982. However, in 1983, almost 700,000 copies of the game were returned, and of the 4 million cartridges that were produced, around 3.5 million were sent back to Atari, either unsold or having been returned by customers. I've actually got one here. Now there it is, one of the 4 million copies. I was holding it upside down. Probably plays better. Despite promising early sales, E.T. was a massive financial failure for Atari, which was compounded by the huge amount of money spent on acquiring the license. The negative response to the game, coupled with that of Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, was a massive blow to Atari's reputation and profitability. The whole debacle didn't just affect Atari, however, it almost killed the entire games industry. In 1983, disaster struck. The oversaturation of home consoles, players' waning interest in console titles, and an overabundance of poor-quality games, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial being the cherry atop that particular plop sundae, caused a massive recession in the video games industry, largely in the United States. Industry revenue had been north of $3 billion in 1983, but by 1985 it had fallen to a fraction of that, around $100 million, which is a drop of nearly 97%. Once upon a time, Atari was perhaps the biggest name in home gaming, but Pac-Man and E.T. caused consumers to lose faith in the company. They ended up losing their market dominance, and the whole industry suffered as a result. For 2 years, the video game industry languished, and it wasn't until Nintendo brought the Famicom to the West in 1985, rebranding it the NES in the process, that things started to pick up again. Still, the damage was done, and it would take decades for the US market to recover. There are a number of ways to react to failure. You could, as our good pal Billy Ray Cyrus would recommend, learn from the experience and use your failure to help you to determine what doesn't work. Or you could give up on your original idea and do something else instead. If neither of those options sound viable to you, though, you could always deal with the failure the Atari way. Load your missteps into the back of a bunch of trucks, drive them out to the New Mexico desert, and bury them under several tons of concrete. When the Alamogordo Daily News reported in September 1983 that between 10 and 20 truckloads of Atari merchandise had been crushed and buried in a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, many didn't believe it. However, it was confirmed by an Atari representative in an article in the New York Times on September the 27th, 1983, that was indeed what had happened, though it wasn't confirmed exactly what was buried out there. In a bizarre move, the day following the New York Times article, a layer of concrete was poured into the landfill, preventing anyone from seeing exactly what had been discarded. It was claimed this had been done to prevent children getting hurt, but I think we all know why it really happened. For over 30 years, the exact contents of the landfill remained a mystery, and though some speculated that the concrete-topped pit was largely filled with unsold copies of E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial, it was never confirmed, and even Howard Scott Warshaw, the game's creator, didn't believe it to be true. Well, the truth has a way of getting out, and in May 2013, the city of Alamogordo granted Canadian entertainment company Fuel Industries permission to excavate the site, and what they found will shock you. It was hundreds of copies of E.T., sorry to spoil the twist immediately. After 3 decades of speculation, the world discovered that what many had believed to be an urban legend, the burial of E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial in the New Mexico desert, had been the truth all along. Of the roughly 700,000 cartridges that had been dumped, only around 1,300 were recovered, with some going to the New Mexico Museum of Space History, around 100 to Fuel Industries and Lightbox, another production company involved in the making of the documentary on the subject, and one even going to the Smithsonian, who added it to their collection. Many of the cartridges were auctioned off by the city of Alamogordo, raising over $100,000 in the process. Fuel Industries and Lightbox were able to use the footage captured during the excavation in their documentary Atari Game Over, which chronicled the downfall of Atari and was released in November 2014 to mostly positive reviews. But what of Atari? Well, I'd like to tell you this story has a happy ending, but unfortunately, not for Atari. The consumer products division of the company was sold to former Commodore International CEO Jack Tramiel in 1984, whilst Atari Inc. remained with Warner. Although Tramiel tried to make a go of it, launching the Atari 2600 Junior in 1986, the company had lost the console market and dropped out of the race following the failure of the Atari Jaguar. Various bits of Atari's corpse were passed from pillar to post through the 80s and 90s, but sadly the company that had once been the biggest name in video games never recovered. For anyone wondering, the Atari Games Library is currently with Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, who acquired it when they bought Midway in 2009. The story of E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial reads like a manual on how not to make a video game. From the moment that Atari decided that the game had to be developed in just 6 weeks, it was doomed to fail. Perhaps if they'd listened to Steven Spielberg and made something more akin to Pac-Man, things would have been different, though considering how bad Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 turned out to be, perhaps not. Still, there are plenty of lessons to be learned from E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. Firstly, if you're going to make a video game, maybe give your dev more than 6 weeks to do it, otherwise you might accidentally kill the whole industry. And secondly, if your failure is big enough, even several tons of concrete won't be enough to hide it forever. That's a good line, actually. I might get that tattoo.